Aristophanes and Politics, and I'm going to share my screen right now. There we go. Yes, my presentation this evening will be in 3 parts. First, I'm going to give you a general overview, some questions that concern Aristophanes and Politics. Second, I'm going to present you a case study, which quite, I hope understandably, comes from my current interest in the leathers and leather making and skins. And then in the end, I'm going to give you my own take on this presentation of scholarly views of my case study. But I think it's better to start. So now, Aristophanes' connection with and his views on politics have been debated a lot in scholarship. This is not surprising, as Aristophanes simply is so very topical. His comedies talk to the audience about what people in Athens talked about and debated with each other in classical polis, city-state, that is. People in the plays comment on the hot issues they take part. They shout about the current issues. They mock public figures whom Aristophanes wanted to criticize. Yet the plays are also comedies. And one function of a comedy is to make you laugh, to parody and exaggerate within the safety of the comic discourse. So the obvious question, which has often been raised, is the connection of the plays with politics, contemporary context, and laughter. What was the role of laughter in Aristophanic comedy? Was it to fume out frustration and anger? Or was laughability of a comedy itself providing a possibility to present serious issues in a safe frame provided by its setting in the yearly City Dionysia drama festival? Or was laughter simply a laughter for jokes in a context where you could laugh together with others who laugh? We know that the laughter generates laughter. It's the usual phenomenon. Maybe it was not a reaction to something contextual at all, something up to date, some pressing issues from which people wanted to release themselves temporarily in the audience of a drama festival. It has indeed been proposed that the question of what makes a joke funny is not an historical problem that can be solved if we know enough about the context, but it rather has more to do with the nature of humor. In this view, Aristophanes would not be a political writer, but simply a comedist, a generator of laughter. But, however, as we say, most often studies on Aristophanes and politics open with drawing parallels between the present day's politics and that what we read into the text of Aristophanes. For example, as you see here on the first slide, it is a quotation from Isabel Ruffel from her article written in 2020. The title is Conservative and Radical, Aristophanic Comedy and Populist Debate in Democratic Athens. So you see, she writes, it is impossible to write on politics, satire and comedy in 2016 to 20 without being influenced by the political events in the UK and the USA. Of course, her own point of view. The British referendum vote to withdraw from the European Union, Brexit, and the Trump presidency, both of which reflect an upsurge of populist politics in the world. While Athenian politics offers a clearly distinct set of historical conditions, its developing force direct democracy demonstrates many of the same functional phenomena that characterize the mere incarnation of populism, and that is the context in which old comedy operated. In this view now then, Aristophanes is very political, and political to us, as his text can be seen to resonate even in our current situation. Actually, in this way, it's kind of a decontextualizing Aristophanes' politics, and at the same time respecting their very context-bound and topical nature is the main point of my talk this evening. This means that Aristophanes talks to us on 2 levels. For us today, surrounded by our own political situation, and as a writer who tells and reflects his own time's political, social, and cultural conditions. He tells us about the politics and society of his own surroundings. These two are, of course, not always very easily reconciled. Let's take a positive kind of approach and let Aristophanes be relevant both for us today and for those who wish to extract information from the classical Athenian life in his texts, at least for this evening. Now, for example, if we see Aristophanes' comedies through the prism of populism, as is done here by Isabel Raphael, then populism is a frame to explain the choice of individual targets of Aristophanic mockery and the mode of comic argumentation, since populism, as we know, eschews logic and expertise, has a strongly nationalist and imperialistic posture, a tendency towards authoritarianism, and an ability to exploit direct engagement with voters and go around the filters of representative democracy with, as it often said, misinformation, hyperbole, and pure deceit. Now, the filter of populism clearly stems from the current today's tendencies in politics, and then the so-called Aristophanes politics becomes also the politics of today. In this perspective, his place can be seen to question and critique democracy then and now. To critique its faults and failures, since Aristophanes was writing in the classical Athens, although during its later phase, which often is in general view regarded as democracy as such, or even the model of it as its first incarnation. In this view, Aristophanes can make us question what actually is democracy, what it was for him and what it is for us now. Is it an ideal which can never be achieved, an idealized situation or model placed in classical Athens by us today? Do we actually seem to lose our touch with this idealized model of democracy as much as Aristophanes did shout about its failures in his own time? We know that he famously took up the issues of women's role and position in society and their potential power. He was hugely and strongly against the then long ongoing Peloponnesian War, etc., etc. And this is why it has been reminded that generally classical comedy made political attacks in the times of democratic self-assertion. This notion could call for our own ponderings on the nature of democracy as well, I think. Now, some scholars have been skeptical about searching Aristophanes' own political views, and therefore they have tried to distance themselves from Aristophanes' own politics. They think that his work is properly to be understood as it was intended, they say, as expressions of the religious festival or a carnival context of the worship of Dionysius Elefthereus. Political truth, let alone any programmatic politics, was neither here nor there. Searching that would be strictly besides the point would this opinion pose. This is, of course, an extreme view, but I think that it's only part of the truth. Namely, Aristophanes' comedies still easily lead to a situation where we find ourselves admitting that any political discussion of the place, sooner or later, will force some kind of confrontation with the question itself. Thus, by nature, Aristophanes' plays are political, regardless of his own political views. Paul Cartledge, who is expert also in Aristophanes, amongst the many other topics, regards his plays as uber political. He strongly points out, as you see here, with the special reference actually to the play Knights, that Aristophanic comedy only could enrich the public discussion of democracy, but also should, it indeed must do so. We must care and care deeply about Aristophanes' politics, he says. Now, this opens yet further questions, such as to whom was Aristophanes writing? Who were there to see and hear his political message, if there was one? It is often reminded that Aristophanes was conveying the political views of a conservative, upper-class citizen, by entertainingly comic dramatic means, of course, but with the underlying serious intent of both advising and criticizing the demos, the people, that is, the populace. This demos at the comedy spectacles was actually there, forming the masses of ordinary Athenians. Whether women were there or so and so, it must be debated, and we are not going to touch that there. But Aristophanes has also been regarded to somehow represent at the point of view of a bit higher classes. Aristophanes presents in his plays what political views or positions or policies it would be most advisable for these demos, people of the Athenians, to adopt. And he tries to persuade them out of their misjudged or ill-judged communal opinions. If we return to the question here of the populism, it has been reminded as well that by and large, Aristophanes focused his mockery on populist politicians who exercised power in the city assembly and the courts, along with their close associates, as well as his fellow artists and tradespeople. He nearly ever targeted elites, often wealthy by birth, oligarchs, people that we would place today to the traditional right. So here, look at this now. For example, in Platos, poverty, personification of poverty, and the character in the play wanders, as you can see. Who would feast to hammer iron, build ships, sew, make wheels, cut leather, bake bricks, bleach linen, tan hides, or break up the soil of the earth with the plough and garner the gifts of Demeter, if he could live in idleness and free from all this work? Could this be regarded, or should it be regarded, as a satirical irony, we could ask? Is it somehow difficult to take straightforward these words as a statement of Aristophanes' own stance about the worth and value of the so-called panausoi, those people who were working on manufacturing, handicrafts, production, etc.? Or how could it be? Can this be regarded also as his scorn of certain traits and mocking them as an exploitative trait for those who profit from it? Particularly certain populists such as Cleon, to whom we come very soon. As we know, the demagogues who had influence on politics in classical Athens were usually not wealthy by descendants, and thus they became contrasted to those who were born of good families, so-called kaloi gagathoi, who were wealthy and educated, and also with some sort of moral supremacy, as they took themselves at least. So it was the manufacturing and trade that had made demagogues rich and consequently influential in society. They were kind of a nouvorish, the Greek term, neoplutoi, in the city. As we see here, Aristophanes to describe them in the Wasps, first citation, where this rich man, this is a bit odd translation, but neoplutos, who should be rich man is not enough, should be some nouveau riche man, but in English we do not have the same expression. It is no surprise that such men were also criticized, and classical comedy is one of our main sources for this. Also the term, and even the term demagogia, as you see there on the lower part of the slide, appears for the first time in Aristophanes' Knights. Here it is, as you see. Leading people is no longer the job for the educated or well-mannered man, but for the ignorant rascal, he says, and at the same time becomes to describe what is demagogia. Despite its topical nature, I think that we have to employ caution when reading Aristophanes' comedies and be mindful of exaggerations, elements of fantasy, and provoking contradictions, which were meant to make the comic drama also funny and at the same time actual. So for the question, where did Aristophanes then stand himself and what political views he held? I actually do find this a bit frustrating question if we are to look at the effects and influence of Aristophanes. As I mentioned above, if regarded as political plays, as I would like to regard them, the effect of them and the ways we interpret politics in them are necessarily influenced and filtered through the political developments in our own time. This is normal and totally acceptable. If we acknowledge this, instead of trying to know the truth of, for example, what ancient Athenians actually did, how they exactly reacted or acted, what they thought and why, we are anyway always giving an interpretation. And the interpretation is, in my view, better if it touches also us, where we are now, and also our own politics. So let Aristophanes be timely now for us today. Let him talk now and for a while to just for us. And this is where I turn to my case study. My meaning is to try to show you that how Aristophanes has been treated in the scholarship when the affairs of the city-state, polis, have been taken to fore and close read historically in order to locate them to their historical context. I do not agree necessarily with everything I'm going to tell, because in the end, I'm going to give you my own take on the matter. This case study now concerns tanning affairs, not sun tanning affairs, but the leather making tanning affairs, for the reason that this has been my focus of interest recently. The play Knights is most often regarded as especially and particularly political play by Aristophanes. It exposes the gullibility of the demos to flattery and the council's susceptibility to satisfying individual interests. The Knights is the play in which Aristophanes sharpens to extreme his hatred and animosity towards Cleon. Here you see a Cleon, of course, with the nose cut off. We could take it here as a reference to smell and smelling. Cleon was the favorite target of Aristophanes' mocking and slander. He figures in each of the first extant comedies of the playwright, and particularly as a disgusting tanner, leather maker, in the play Knights. Cleon was a demagogue. At the time, the public hero in Athens after the victory of Pylos. At the time, I mean, when Aristophanes wrote the Knights. He had been credited a privileged seating in the public spectacles. He was seen to sail his military political career smoothly at the time. So we can also think that Cleon was actually present in the plays, in the series of these anti-Cleon plays that Aristophanes wrote, and this may also change a little bit how to we perceive the plays themselves. It is mostly Aristophanes and Thucydides who paint a picture of Cleon as a pure populist, an unscrupulous, warmongering demagogue, horrible person. Although there certainly is some seed of truth in this here, we should still remember that, for example, Cleon nevertheless died together with Spartan general Brasidas at the Battle of Amphipolis in 422 BC. And their deaths removed the chief obstacle to peace after this long ongoing war. And then the peace was finally signed the very same year, known as the Peace of Nicaeas. Thanks to Aristophanes' animosity towards Cleon, allusions of and reference to leatherworking and tanning in Aristophanes' plays are very frequent, almost omnipresent, particularly in Knights. Namely, Cleon is known now to have derived historically his wealth from hides and skins. As a proprietor and operator of large tannery, Cleon had inherited a large tannery from his father in Ateenan. Here you see where it is. In Ateenan, close to the river Eridanos and particularly Ilissos in Athens. This picture here, the map is not very accurate, but you see there on the lower part of there is a Ateenan marked with the big letters. It should be actually a little bit more eastwards, but the area that I'm mostly talking about here and are going to talk now concerns where you have the river Ilissos marked as a river on the blue on the map. So in Nights, Aristophanes presents Cleon as a stinking Paphlagonian tanner. Now, Paphlagonian works as an ethnic pejorative attribution here. As we heard Antti talking in the first lecture, this is a very apparent example as well. Paphlagonians were namely perceived as uncultured natives, thick and uneducated people in northern, somewhere far away there in northern Asia Minor. Most often they were in Athens. When they were at Athens, they were slaves. And even the term Paphlazein means to splatter, as a reference to their ethnic vocal mannerisms. They were also associated as wearing usually rough leather boots, garbatinai type of brogues, and particularly as smelling heavily of garlic. In terms of politics, we could now consider why and how is this smelly rogue Paphlagon exactly Cleon? And why did Aristophanes hate him that much? Because he did really seem to hate him pretty much. Remember that he was actually just a 20-year-old when the Night was performed at the drama festival. And 18 when his first play, Babylonians, was first performed. In the Nights, Aristophanes comes really across as an angry young man. He's politically angry and frustrated, if we was to see him as such. He's not actually, as on this slide, we think of him as almost kind of a statesman-like manners with the beard and all, but he was just simply 20-year-old. So could his hatred also been motivated by much complex reasons? Probably girl or a boy. Had there been a great argument in a drunken symposium where dispute went absolutely through the roof? It should also be remembered that a populist such as Cleon was generally a perfect target of mockery in comedy. Thus, Paphlagon here is not necessarily an accurate representation of the person Cleon, but it's also a comic caricature of a ridiculous politician. Namely, as we well know, populist politicians are in general a perfect comic material. As much as satirists themselves, they also persuade without necessarily marshalling in rational argument. They appeal through images, sensual devices, even smell, and particularly emotions. They do not use reasonable debate to further their opinions. So sizing up humor in Aristophanes is much more than a historical contextual problem. But nevertheless, see what scholars have now found out and proposed about this relationship between Cleon and Aristophanes. Because clearly, as I said, I'm not denying Aristophanes' hatred to the historical person Cleon. It was there, but I'm just talking about the reasons. And now let's see what scholars have proposed. You know, Aristophanes associates tanners with the low social status of slaves and persons of barbarian origin. They have the villainous disposition and a strong person for slander, he writes in the Nights. They are often also foreign origin. They are in Athens, they are slaves. Aristophanes actually goes pretty far. For example, Suda, much later, of course, Suda's text, explains that Aristophanes' attribution of Cleon in peace as scatophagos is a reference to his trade as a tanner who had to tan hides and thus works with excrement and animal dung. Scatophagos meaning someone who eats shit. So he goes pretty far, Aristophanes, in his characterizations of Cleon. You see in this slide here that Aristophanes brings Cleon into the scene in the beginning of the Nights, and this the first quotation is from the beginning of the play, and it makes it clear right at the start that this person is not for his liking. Tanner from Paphlagon is slave, a Paphlagonian tanner, an arrogant rogue, an incarnation of a calumny. This is a man of leather, Pyrso Paphlagon. The chorus leader's advice makes Aristophanes' deeply felt animosity towards Cleon very clear as well later in the play, the second quotation there. This public robber, this yawning gulf of plunder, this devouring Charybdis, this villain. I cannot say the word too often, for he is the villain of 1,000 times a day. come, strike, drive, hurl him over and crush him to pieces. Hate him as we hate him. Stun him with your blows and your shouts. And so it goes on. All this hurling and striking and beating and these very physical terms and verbs actually are the words that describe also the tanning methods when the leather was made. So Cleon in one way is a personification of a tanner, and tanning was something that was regarded as disgusting. And also the skin, the man of hides, because hide also often represents a persona. So when you beat Cleon, you beat his hide, but you beat also his personality. So Aristophanes was legally from the district of Ateenan, as I mentioned, following his father Philippos. He associated himself indirectly with Heracles in Parapasis of two plays, The Wasps and Peace. They are very well-known passages, both of them. Remember, Heracles will come up now in what I tell you in the following. So here he says in The Wasps that this is Aristophanes talking directly to the audience as Aristophanes in the play. As bold as Heracles himself, thus Aristophanes attacked the most formidable of monsters, and so on and so forth. Now, we have interesting inscription, text written on the stone, from the very late 4th century or the beginning of the 3rd century BC. It is actually a cult table, trapeza, listing the names of 15 members of a theasos, that is a religious association for Heracles, with the priest. And the priest, and listing also the 15 members and the priest of this association for the god Heracles in Ateenan, probably. Among the names, there are names such as Amphitheos, Philonides, and Simon, men who can be, you see them there on this text, among the names listed on the inscription. All of these three can be associated with the place of Aristophanes. Simon, the priest of this Theasos, religious association of Heracles, belonged to the class of Hippes, the knights, as that was the name of the play. He was Hippos himself, and also one of the chorus leaders in the knights itself. Then Philonides, for his part, produced a number of Aristophanes plays from 422 BC onwards. And lastly, Amphitheos, whose name is very unusual, it is not appearing very often, appears as a character in the Acharnians. Furthermore, the chorus of young playwrights and Aristophanes' first play, Banqueteers, was made up of a company of men who had just finished a meal in the temple of Heracles. And this has made some scholars to believe that the chorus in this play portrayed, in fact, this very same religious association of the Theasos, which we see also inscribed on the stone. So therefore, it seems probable that Aristophanes knew well what was going on in this district of Ateenan in Athens. He embedded references to his political agenda in his plays, and that his enmities towards Cleon could have had to do with the politics of the district itself, particularly the issues relating to the tanneries and disputes between the neighbors regarding the tanneries in particular. If this is the case, could be, could not be, but if it is, tanning had become a financial dispute in which Aristophanes actually took part for his part. Mocking Cleon the tanner, who owned these big tanneries, as a stupid nouveau riche, a stinking tanner who had to be banished with his tannery. And in one way actually was in the end of the night, where he is seen selling sausages by the city gates on the outskirts of Athens. Actually, we have indeed one very rare inscriptions attesting the tanning operations in Athens in the classical time. And it is an interesting inscription in this regard, because it directly mentions tanning operations in Athens. It is the so-called tanner decree. It is from 440 to 420 BC. And the text seems to prohibit anyone to tan hides, or actually to tramp on them, to tan them, to dip them into the river in the tanning operations, River Ilissus, above the sanctuary of Heracles. And the river is then flowing to the other direction from this place. It also prohibits tanners to throw rubbish into the river using the very interesting term katharmata. It rules then of course that the decree had to be erected on the both sides of the river at this point in question where it was erected. It wasn't found on the spot, but it refers itself where it had to be placed. This text attests then the connection of the raw material for tanning operations by Ilissus River with the sanctuary of Heracles and the district of Ateenan. With the aim was obviously to prevent the river from being polluted by these offscourings from the tanning operations, pieces of meat and all the disgusting things that tanning actually produces, which are called the katharmata, the concept which I will not elaborate further now, but in another other time then. Because now what interests us here is that the banks of the river Ilissus were described in ancient text as a very idyllic place where flowers bloomed and the river Ilissus glittered tranquilly in an almost bucolic beauty and delight. This actually may be the reason why this area was of particular interest of topographical studies, especially in the 19th century, when the Romantics and the Khan tourists, as we often call them, and early travelers and scholars wanted to retrieve the walks and perambulations of Plato in this idealized environment. It was still now the Ilissus River is covered up, unfortunately, but still when this picture has been taken 1910, it still is quite attractive place and glittering waters and so on. But here we have Plato, who as a model delivered a description of this idyllic landscape with the plane trees, crystal waters, grassy slopes, and which were under the constant sound of little wonderful birds and animals and the rustling of the air among the leaves. By hero, what a fine place for rest. How large and tall this platanus tree is. And this chestnut tree, how magnificent is its shade and majestic its branches. These places are all in bloom and balmy. A delicious spring ripples at the roots of this platanus, and by dipping our feet, we may feel the coolness of its waters. To judge by these figurines and the statues, one might say that this abode is consecrated to nymphs and to the Archelos River. How the air that we breathe here is sweet and agreeable. It's like the perfume of summer, harmonious with the chorus of grasshoppers. But what I like best is this soft turf, thick enough to rest our heads comfortably, stretching ourselves on this gently inclined ground. My dear Phaedrus, you could have not led me to a better place. Doesn't sound like a bad place at all. Quite nice. But now we have the tanneries there. We have the dispute which had to do with with offscourings, pollution, and probably also the smell. And then the question of the sanctuary of Heracles. Here we come back to Heracles I mentioned earlier. Because now the location of the sanctuary of Heracles close to the river Ilissus and the gymnasium of Kynosarges has long been disputed in the scholarship since the early 19th century, in fact, and opinions still vary. There were a few sanctuaries dedicated to Heracles that we know along the river Ilissus, and the whole Kynosarges area there belonged to this god, including the arable land around, which can be judged from leases for properties and plots of arable land belonging to Heracles. These lands were leased to private individuals for the benefit of Heracles' cult in the 4th century BC. So now you can see, I hope, how the pieces of the puzzle start fitting in the historical sense of the explanation why Aristophanes hated Cleon into places. So the puzzle is here. Aristophanes associates himself with Heracles in a number of his plays due to, it has been proposed, connection with the worship of the god Ateenan area. There we have the Tanner degree, this inscription, which nicely dates to the years of the production of Aristophanes' Anti-Cleon, the Tanner place that it is. There were disputes concerning the tanning operations, which tie this whole thingy to the leather issue, Cleon and Aristophanes together. So, it should be noted, I think, however, there's always a however, that this is a historical interpretation of ancient text from a particular tanning point of view. It's interesting potential scenario, which is not the only possibility to understand Aristophanes' bitterness towards Cleon the tanner in this case. But nevertheless, populist leaders who had gained in popularity were fiercely criticized by certain sections of society, and there were often the economic reasons behind this as well. And of course, this is not an unfamiliar situation to us today neither. Now, we can easily find parallels for the situation where such a politician like Cleon just sailed on and made wealth on his own, probably even more profitable tanneries in this case. Aristophanes now tried to fight him all over again in the first place, then Achaeans, then knights again, with all his verbal weapons of within the polis theater institution, but people voted for this leader nevertheless. So, because I've been a bit scared, I've been giving options for many interpretations. I'm now getting to my own and heading to the last part of my presentation here. So let the Elisa stay there for a while. Instead, or perhaps rather, in addition to cleaning out this kind of detailed historical contextual information that I did present to you, I would like to propose also a larger questions relating to our understanding and interpretations of Aristophanes' views on Cleon. One of them relates to smell, and this is why I have this term stinking in the title of my talk this evening. Cleon, of course, also stinks in Aristophanes' comedies. He stinks since tanners do smell foul. They also smell. Aristophanes' description of Cleon is characteristically of all olfactory, having to do with the smell, that is. The smell is thus one of the primary associations to identify Cleon's trait, tanning, leather making. The accusation of Cleon's dysosmia, bad smell, is explicit here, where Demos cries to Cleon, "Get away from me with your horrible smell of rawhide." Now, actually, Aristophanes enforces here his description of a tanner, Cleon's repellence and foulness, with allusion to smell, which functions as a synecdoche to Cleon's repulsive persona. It's also enforced by the use of the term byrsa there, as you say, which means rawhide. It denotes untanned rawhide of an ox. And it really is then this rough and thick and somehow horrible, raw, untanned, semi-living thing. With Cleon and his own trait of tanning, the association is straightforward and sensorially effective. On the basis of Aristophanes' plays, it is difficult actually to visualize Cleon's outlook, since Aristophanes does not describe his appearance to the eye, but his olfactory smell appearance is, on the contrary, easy to capture in many of his plays. So here the tanner is an attribute of scorn for Athenian politicians with menial background in manual labor, probably even with history in slavery, or as traders who went from poorness to wealth. A tanner is then not a tanner only. It's not only a tanner, but the term to point to a disreputable character of the person. Aristophanes' Cleon, the tanner, had thus a long-term influence as a topos of a negative image of a tanner in cultural discourse. Through this example, you can see how our interpretations may generate new ways of looking at how we conceptualize, for example, outsiderness or those who are regarded, be excluded, even politically excluded. Associations with tanners in ancient text in general are mostly negative, sometimes even aggressively so. Tanning was seen, as I mentioned earlier, a trade suitable for slaves, and its practitioners were poor, possibly and often of foreign origin. So tanning can be regarded as a shorthand for a cluster of negative connotations and programmatic for a generally negative discourse. Descriptions of tanners can therefore be regarded as a way to define a desired identity and to draw a boundary between those who are included in and those who are excluded from the pure core of a city-state or from the concept of Greekness, both concretely and symbolically. Can this be then regarded as a sign of Aristophanes' own sympathies towards those upper class kaloi kakathoi, the well-born who scorned the banausoi manufacturers? Here, the imagery that you see on these slides, the imagery associated with tanners is forceful, probably because it encompasses multisensory aspects with olfactory, visual, sensual, emotional, and cultural associations alike. Tanners stink. They are dirty, gruesome, masculine, poor, and work with dead animals and are often in slavery. This is an early woodcut from 1530s. Which is kind of a iconic, one of the iconic early visual depictions of the tanners, and they really are very masculine. You can almost smell them there. But also, of course, because this is so, the tanners are perfect comic material as well. They are also even dangerously good material for long-term othering, so-called othering processes, and the formation of socio-political and cultural meanings. In short, representations of tanning and tanners are not independent, since subject of representations are formed, defined, and reproduced in accordance with the requirements of political, juridical, and social structures. An olfactory associations of tanners is so vigorous that we may ask whether it has affected the way tanners are treated and placed into society and perceived culturally over very long periods of time. Since sense of smell is, as we know, probably one of the least valued of our senses, but at the same time, it may have and does have very powerful implicit effects, which are harder to externalize than, for example, visual or auditive senses. Smells and odors affect us on physical, psychological, social, and cultural levels. They obtain cultural value-coded associations and long-lasting cultural meanings, and hence can be seen as sites where to produce and reproduce social differences. In short, smell can be regarded as an agent in the creation of cultural and social meanings. Olfactory sense plays an important role in the conceptualizing of what is regarded as disgusting. And this is where I stop. And this is where I let you decide for yourself what you would pick up in Aristophanes in his Politics. He does offer treasure for endless interpretations. And, well, none is not necessarily more correct than another.